So thank you, Henrietta, for that introduction, and thank you to those of you for coming here. I've spoken at Birmingham on several occasions over the years, but to sociology and politics and sometimes to political groups. I've never spoken to classics, so I feel like I've really finally made it as a scholar, that I'm speaking to one of our foundational disciplines. So thank you very much. And congratulations on bringing the network from Glasgow down to Birmingham. I don't know if your colleagues here fully appreciate how successful and impressive that network has been. It's in a very short space of time. It's certainly put to shame my meagre efforts at bringing scholars together. It has brought people from linguistics and history and politics and philosophy, and it's connected us with speechwriters from London, from Glasgow and Edinburgh and all sorts of places. It's been really, really good. It was a really impressive example of how you can combine scholars to do more than they could do alone, while each still maintains and furthers the integrity of their specific subjects. And I've learnt a lot from talking to classicists, more even than I ever learnt from reading classics. And it's been really beneficial, and it's a really fantastic thing for you to have here at Birmingham. So what I'm going to talk about today then draws on those kinds of conversations I've had with classicists and draws on from my readings of classical literature, but I'm certainly not a classicist. I don't have that kind of expertise, and I would be delighted to hear from people how they think about some of the issues I'm going to raise, drawing on their different kinds of understandings of classical, perhaps Renaissance and contemporary rhetoric. But I do wonder what Cicero would have made if he looked at our political situation today. I think he might have found it in some respects not entirely unfamiliar. Empires in decline, suffering from moral corruption, politicians perhaps concerned with their own self-interest too often rather than the common good, too much money in politics and these kinds of things. But I wonder what he would have made of the oratory and of the spectacles of our politics. Would he have found them strange, worrying, or would he have found them relatively familiar spectacles? Or would he, like so many of us today, have just found a lot about contemporary politics utterly bewildering, confusing, strange, and downright weird? Some of the things that have happened recently, I'm thinking obviously of Brexit, but not necessarily the vote itself, but the way in which the Brexit referendum took place. The role played in that referendum campaign by someone like Boris Johnson, who is a very particular and distinctive political performer and political stylist, or of someone like Nigel Farage, a very unusual, distinct and incredibly successful political performer. But apart from Brexit, the Corbyn phenomenon in this country, the very unexpected rise to power of someone who might otherwise have seemed both unassuming and destined to permanent marginality. And in the US, what's been going on in the election there with Donald Trump would seem to be part of a much more widespread phenomenon of, perhaps we might say, excessive, dramatic, perhaps bizarre political figures rising to unexpected prominence. And what all of them seem to have in common is the way in which they are very much performances. They are figures who embody and express a style of political communication, a style of political being that is very unusual from what has been the norm for the last few years, but also the way in which they seem to be, in some respects, caricatures of the politics that they espouse. Part of what Corbynism is Corbyn himself, his unassuming manner, his not wearing the formal clothes of politicians, his appeal to his supporters as someone who is straight-talking and honest, his relative lack of oratorical grandeur being precisely part of his oratorical appeal. Or someone like Farage, with his studied manner, smoking and drinking, talking about being an ordinary bloke down the pub, also seems to embody in some way the politics that he espouses. But the rise of these kind of figures leads many people to be concerned about the fate of our politics, to see it as far too focused on spectacle, performance and personality, rather than on the complex and difficult issues and challenges that we face. So many people looking at politics in our country, in the US, might see it as just now hopelessly mired in irrational decisions and arguments, detached from reality, too much driven by the media, by a showbiz style of performance and spectacle, the passions dominating over reason, a so-called post-truth political world. And that sort of critique has led increasingly to arguments which are at the least critical of democracy and in some respects quite hostile to democracy, seeing democracy itself as at fault for throwing up these seemingly unsuitable and dramatic characters. For example, a political theorist called Jason Brennan has recently released a book called Against Democracy, and he proposes what he calls epistocracy, rule of the knowledgeable. Votes, he says, should be apportioned according to people's knowledge. On what grounds could you give everyone an equal vote when it's clear, all the evidence shows, not everybody takes their vote as seriously as everybody else, not everyone takes time to understand the issues, not everyone can take time to understand all the issues and all their complexity. Given that citizens are ignorant and irrational in the ways in which they access and process information, Brennan suggests we should at very least have tests before people run for office, and perhaps give people votes only on the basis of passing a test, or give some people more votes than others. It's an idea that was first proposed by John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. And that's just one example of a growing range of comment in the newspapers and in academia, motivated by anxiety as to the ways in which democracy is going, its seeming abandonment of reason and truth. So my question then is it true that we have given up informed, rational discussion of the issues for mere spectacle, mere personality, and so on? And my answer is going to be that it's not true, but not because our politics isn't full of spectacle and personality, but because spectacle and personality have always been part of democratic politics and are necessarily a part of democratic politics. And, mostly, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. That's not to say that I'm sanguine about the present situation, but a critique of spectacle and personality in politics needs to be based on some clear idea of what we want politics to be like. It doesn't have to be a critique of spectacle as such. It may be a critique of how the spectacles play out in the particular situations we find ourselves in. And we need to know what spectacle and personality are for in politics before we can decide whether they are good or bad. In another recent work, this time of political science, Aiken and Bartels, in Democracy for Realists, present what would only really be a discovery for a certain sort of North American political scientist. They conclude, they say, that group and partisan loyalties, not policy preferences or ideologies, are fundamental in democratic politics. They go on to say a realistic theory of democracy must be built not on the French Enlightenment or on British liberalism or on American progressivism, with their devotion to human rationality and individualism, but instead on the insights of the critics of these traditions who recognise that human life is group life. So Aiken and Bartels, they argue, people don't go around making rational individual choices about what's in their interest. They make choices based on their sense of group and partisan loyalty and feeling. Of course they do, I'm inclined to reply. Politics is precisely about how groups form, how people see themselves as belonging to one group rather than others, how people form a sense of common interest and common purpose. And one of the ways in which they do that, I'm going to argue, is precisely through political performances of personality and spectacle. So I want to start, not with the present, I want to start sort of with ancient Rome, but really with Elizabethan England, with Coriolanus. In Shakespeare's tragedy, as I'm sure many of you know, a war hero assumes high office, but it all goes horribly wrong. He's exiled, he ends up conspiring and attacking his own city before he is murdered by his co-conspirators. So the question for all good literary critics would be, what's the source of the tragedy in this play? Is it, as many suggest, the scheming tribunes, cynical politicians just looking for any way to advance their career? Is it the venal and pampered plebeians, the mob that just wants to be pleased and entertained rather than take seriously the demands of public and political life? Is it Coriolanus' desire for glory? Is it, as some critics suggest, politics itself, such a hopelessly compromising activity that no man of honour could prosper within it. Well, I want to suggest that the source of the tragedy in Shakespeare's play is none of these things. It's stage fright. Martius, the hero of War with the Volscians, refuses to perform the role of Coriolanus, the hero of War with the Volscians. He is required to perform rituals to accede to high office, and he refuses to do so. He won't wear the ceremonial gown of humility. He won't deliver the speech to the people that they demand. In the play, Sicinius, a tribune, insists to him, "Sir, the people must have their voices, neither will they bate one jot of ceremony." Menenius, Martius, his friend, urges him, "Fit you to the custom, and take to you, as your predecessors have, your honour with your forms." Match. If you do what you have to do, maintain your honour, but accept the form. But in the face of public demand and the obligations of tradition, Coriolanus still complains, "It is a part that I shall blush in acting." As well as stage fright, he lacks ability too. Menenius tells us, "Consider this. He has been bred in the wars since he could draw a sword, and is ill-schooled in bolted language. Meal and bran together he throws without distinction. He has no sense of eloquence, no skill of delivering such fine speeches." Martius himself says, "When blows have made me stay, I fled from words." He's a fighting man, not a man of political speech. "I cannot bring my tongue to such a pace," he says, and when forced to perform before the plebeians, he insults them, and all things begin to fall apart. So because of his stage fright, because of his lack of skill in eloquence, Coriolanus cannot play the role assigned to him, the role of political leader. And because he can't play that role, the people cannot play theirs. They cannot be a people. And as a result, crisis ensues. The city falls apart, and politics collapses and gives way to war. Now, why should we care what Shakespeare has to say to us about such things in Coriolanus? Well, what he's describing, the speech rituals that Coriolanus refuses to perform, are not a Shakespearean invention. They are rituals that we find all over classic and contemporary, traditional and modern, primitive, ancient and society today. The ritual he is to perform is a classic one of liminality, of transition from one stage to another, a rite of passage. In that rite, Martius is to be stripped of his robes, reduced to one of lowly or no status, and then remade and reborn as Coriolanus. And such a process, as the anthropologist Victor Turner argues, whether it occurs in a play or in examples in real life, such a process is not only about legitimising the hierarchy, it's also, Turner says, a matter of giving recognition to an essential and generic human bond, without which there could be no society. Liminality, these moments of transition, implies that the high could not be high unless the low existed, and he who is high must experience what it is like to be low. It's a way in which the ritual affirms the collectivity, their common purpose and their fellowship, binds the ruler and ruled together in a common purpose. And such rites are not only a part of acquiring office, they are a part of holding office. Another example which I rather like, one closer in time and closer to our immediate concerns today, is found in a 1948 study of political organisation among Native Americans. Robert Lowy records the following example from a study of the Cherokee. "On many evenings, I saw the chief assemble the village. Stepping in front of the semicircle, he would impressively and vividly harangue the crowd for possibly an hour. Usually he circumstantially explained the half-forgotten ceremonial of some festival. There followed a lengthy admonition to preserve ancient usage, and in conclusion he would urge all to live in peace and harmony." You can perhaps imagine what such a speech would sound like. But what's important here is that in this speech what matters is not what he says, but just simply that the chief says it. In a way, he doesn't say anything, he repeats a standard, generic, established template. And as the witness records, the audience doesn't always even pay that much attention. Nevertheless, the ritual takes place regularly. It is a speech which, because it is part of an established ritual, is not wholly in the control of the chief who gives it. He must say what he is expected to say. He must say what the audience expects and perhaps wants to hear. So he's not fully in charge, and they are the ones who can decide to pay attention or to be bored, disinterested, not take part. The French anthropologist Pierre Clastres has argued on the basis of examples such as this that in these kinds of societies, speaking is not a right of power, but a duty. Indian societies, Clastres writes, do not recognise the chief's right to speak because he is the chief. They require that the man destined to be chief prove his command over words. Speech is an imperative obligation for the chief. The tribe demands to hear him, and a silent chief is no longer a chief. As Clastres explains, the chief is, as it were, confined by and to the domain of speech, within which he owes talk as an obligation to the group for whom he is responsible. So we might bear these kinds of examples in mind, Coriolanus or examples such as that of the Charente, and think about our own contemporary speech-based rituals of politics. In this country, the so-called speech from the throne, the Queen's speech to Parliament, an elaborate and excessive ritual in which she must give the words that she has been told to give by the Parliament that represents the people. Or the inauguration speech given by American presidents, another one which, while it's always distinct and represents something specific about each new president, must also conform to a ritualized template and demonstrate something about the unity and purpose of the people, rather than about the singularity of purpose of the new president. Similarly in the US, the State of the Union address, party convention speeches, but in this country, conference speeches that our leaders must give every year. It's hard to imagine one remaining a leader for very long if they refuse to give their speech in Blackpool or Brighton. And when they give a speech that is poor, that is not well received, their leadership is in doubt. When they give a speech that is great, that says what the audience likes and to which it responds well, their leadership is seen as being more secure. Think about electoral campaign appearances. These too are also effectively requirements placed on politicians to display themselves in publicly, make their case, present their arguments, attend television debates. We might also in this country look at the House of Commons, which is many, many things all at once, but one of them is a stage of public performance. Think of an event like Prime Minister's Questions. Again, something which is, although an informal element of the Commons procedural rules, is effectively an obligation. Prime Ministers must attend and answer those questions. And when you read their memoirs, they are, all of them report how anxious they are every week about attending Prime Minister's Questions. Tony Blair talks about feeling nauseous before attending the Commons and having to deal with the questions asked of him. So these are not simply events at which leaders lord it all over us and make us admire them and applaud them. There's something much more complicated going on here. And we might even see elements of the same in press conferences or in political interviews, those strange, often unsatisfying combats between journalist and politician, which perhaps begin to make more sense if we think of them as rituals of some kind, tests of competence, demonstrations of character or its lack. So let's think about that a little bit more. Because an interesting argument about this kind of thing, or I think it's about this kind of thing, has recently been made by the American political theorist Geoffrey Green. And what Green does is distinguish between two conceptions of popular power. The first of which is the one we're mostly familiar with. It's the one to do with voice. Literally or metaphorically, the voice of the people. We think that the power of the populace is best expressed by their voice being made, by the voice being heard, by their voice being represented in some way, included by some mechanism in the legislative process. Representation makes that voice heard, amplifies it, and so on. But Green suggests that this emphasis on the voice, on vocal power, obscures from us the importance of something else, which he calls ocular power, the power of vision, the power of sight, the power of the gaze, the power of a public looking at what it sees and judging what appears before it. Green wants to draw attention to the potential power of spectatorship. We might think that spectators are passive, unengaged, But of course, when we pause and we think about our own experiences as spectators, we are anything but passive. We can be very attentive, very studious in thinking about what is being put before us. We can respond with applause, with cheers, or with boos and with jeers. Spectators have a critical power, Green argues, to see and to judge what is put before them. Here, representation, however, means something perhaps slightly different from what it means in the case of voice. Representation here also means something aesthetic, a standing for, meaning an appearance, being like, looking in a certain sort of way. This is close to what Michael Soward, British political theorist, calls the representative claim. Soward's point is that in political life, as well as representing others through policies that will serve their interests or will advance their cause, there must always be what he calls a claim to represent or to know what represents the interests of someone or something. In other words, a claim to bring forward or enact policies that are in your interests always implies some prior claim that I know what your interests are, that I will represent your interests, that I am someone who is on your side, shares something in common with you. To be convinced then that a policy is in our interest, we might also need to be convinced that the one proposing it really has our interests in mind. And politics, as Geoffrey Green says then, is not solely concerned with debates about judgment and judgments about laws, though of course it is. It's also about looking at and judging political leaders. So Green proposes the concept of candour, by which he means, quote, an institutional requirement that leaders not be in control of the conditions of their publicity. They must make appearances in public, he says, which are neither rehearsed, pre-planned, nor managed from above, but rather contain all the risk and uncertainty of spontaneous public events, so that there is an opportunity for us to observe their candour and judge what we think of what they perform or present in front of us. Green's point is not that we should celebrate pure spectacle, so-called pseudo-events, all those staged managed campaign stops that appear to be full of cheering and admiring crowds but are really only full of a few supporters filmed from the right angle, or the artificial photo opportunities. These disfigure our politics. But what we want then are what Green calls eventful events, ones in which, as he puts it, we do not observe merely what we already know or what someone else wants us to know, but something that is revealed in the course of the happening itself. And importantly, at such occasions, he suggests, the inequality between ruler and ruled is challenged, but challenged by a negative egalitarianism. It brings leaders down to our level, rather than pretending that we are up high with them. It brings them down so we can see and experience our equality with them and judge the ways in which they speak and perform to us. That might be one way of understanding something like Prime Minister's Questions, which I know is not a ritual that everyone finds pleasing or supports, and many political scientists are critical of it. But I think if one understands it as performing this particular role, one can begin to see there is something potentially important there, that the representative of sovereign power is required to turn up to a room and be told where they are wrong, and required to respond convincingly. So the question we might have then about our current politics would not be, is it too full of spectacle and personality, but are the events, are the spectacles, are the ways in which personality is made known to us good enough? Are they eventful events in Green's terms? Are they instances that show candour? Are they opportunities for publics to exercise judgment over our politicians, and is that judgment exercised well? But what then are we judging? How are we judging, and what is it that we're looking at when we consider these different kinds of spectacles? So now I want to bring in something not from political theory, but from the perspective of cultural sociology. I want to draw on the idea of collective representation, concept associated with Emile Durkheim. Without going on a long disquisition about Durkheim, really what he means by collective representations is something like shared ideas. Not simply opinions and substantive claims about things, but rather shared ideas at the level of how we order, classify and evaluate the things in the social world. Durkheim suggests that language, and consequently the system of concepts which it translates, is the product of a collective elaboration. We share a system of reference and meaning. And that system therefore expresses the manner in which society as a whole, he says, represents to itself the facts of experience. And that's one thing to say about small-scale, simple societies. They share a very intense set of representations of the world that mean they very easily and straightforwardly agree on how to understand what they see and what happens to them. What about in complex mass societies like ours? Well, here, we might say, collective representations still exist and form societies, but they are contested. There is no settled agreement on exactly how we want to order, classify and interpret the world. Think of an issue prevalent in the American presidential campaign, such as gender roles. There is contestation over how we understand and allocate persons and roles relating to their gender. And that contestation plays out in all sorts of areas of society and culture, in drama and fiction, but formal politics also forms a vital part of that questioning and reconstitution of our collective representation of something like gender roles. It stages it, it dramatises it. As the sociologist Geoffrey Alexander puts it, to struggle for power in democratic societies, one must become a collective representation, a symbolic vessel filled with what citizens hold most dear, he says, an expression of the moods and meanings of the nation's democratic life. In that sense, larger-than-life public and political figures are a means of having societal disputes, of carrying out arguments about how we understand and collectively represent the world. For Geoffrey Alexander, the contemporary public sphere is not best thought of as a forum for rational debate. It is rather a public stage, a symbolic forum in which actors have some freedom to create and to project performances of their reasons, dramas tailored to audiences whose voices, Green would say, whose vision, have become legitimate references in political conflicts. In other words, part of democracy is not simply increasing rationalisation of political life, it's also increasing opportunities to have these kinds of staged dramatisations of the deep level conflicts that are playing out in our culture and society as a whole. In this context, political actors, says Alexander, strive to be seen as interpreters of social texts. They try to transform interest conflicts, he says, into symbolic performances through which they present themselves as grand protagonists, exemplifications of sacred religious and secular texts. One might think of the previous presidential elections, the way in which Obama successfully presented himself as a dramatisation and embodiment of what he called in a famous speech in the primary campaign, the original sin of slavery in American life, the stain on the Constitution, his own being, his own campaign, being a way in which that was being dramatised and worked through. The promise of the civil rights movement from the 60s continued and in some measure fulfilled through his own performance and his own being, but not for him, for the nation as a whole. We might then think of our political figures as performing fundamental characters from our culture, from our ways of thinking about the world, playing roles that we recognise, trying to redefine the nature of those roles, question the boundaries, close down the opportunities for other kinds of performance, and presenting that to audiences who then make judgments about them. We might look at the election in the US and see that one of the things that's happening there is a strange, rather intense, sometimes ugly, but potentially very important and powerful dramatisation of conflicts around gender roles that have been going on since the 1960s. It's not coincidental that they are both of the same sort of generation, from the generation that saw the rise of the women's movement and the development of the rise to power of feminism in the US, and here it is being played out in these dramatised forms, a kind of hyper crude masculinity on one hand versus the new, potentially, the new competent, likely to be presidential figure on the other side. It's a weird kind of upsurge from the unconscious of a culture representing a conflict that's still playing itself out and providing a society with an opportunity to decide where it wishes to go. So what's all that got to do with oratory and rhetoric? I've been talking about public speaking and appearances and performances, but rhetoric, I think, can help us see something else that's going on here. Rituals and performances of the kind I'm describing can, I think, contain leaders, direct and control them in some respects, can make possible audiences' judgments of character, and they can be seen as manifestations of conflicts over fundamental collective representations. I want to introduce two rhetorical concepts that I think help us take this a little bit further. The first of these is the concept of the enthymeme, which in classical rhetoric is the distinctive form of logic associated with rhetoric. But what's crucial about it is that it's a form of reasoning that is dependent on or adapted to the common opinion of the audience to whom one is speaking. That's why philosophers like Plato don't like rhetoric, because they see it as pandering to audiences, drawing on their incomplete, imperfect, unscientific knowledge to make deductions about things people are not necessarily competent to make deductions about. But the counter-argument of the rhetorician would be to say, this is how we organise and form processes of collective decision-making. We connect claims that we are making about current things that are happening or things that might happen to already established opinions shared by the community to whom we are speaking. So, for instance, a culture like ours, on the whole, for the most part, people are going to agree with a vague moral sentiment like people shouldn't get rich for doing nothing, but they might also agree with a sentiment like it's good that people get rewarded for skill and hard work. But to what do those vague, general, important, nevertheless, moral attitudes belong? To what are they applied? Are bankers people getting rich for doing nothing, or people who are skilled and hard-working and getting appropriately rewarded? Are footballers skilled and getting appropriately rewarded, or ludicrously overpaid for nothing of significance? What about school teachers? One of the ways in which political argument works then is trying to connect that kind of moral sentiment of a people to a specific issue, to a particular case, so that we might see it in a certain way and begin to conclude that some particular course of action might be taken. And when that happens, then, a community is, as it were, applying its common values, reasoning collectively to make decisions about what should be done. As the contemporary rhetorical theorist Thomas Farrell puts it, rhetoric involves the implementation of practical wisdom, quote, through the participation of someone else, the rhetorical audience. And because the appeals that are made are adapted to what that community already thinks, what's happening is that its values and principles are being put on display. Through rhetoric, he says, the norms and conventions of a culture find themselves employed as premises of both recognition and inference. They are put to the test and collectively practiced. To the enthymeme, I want to bring in a second key rhetorical concept, that of ethos, one of the three fundamental appeals described in Aristotle's Rhetoric. Ethos is the appeal rooted in character. Part of trying to prove our case is showing that we are the kind of person that you want to listen to, that you might respect, that you might trust, that you might admire. But there's more to the appeal to ethos than simply appearing like a trustworthy, decent person. In contemporary politics, the ethos of a politician may not be their own, it may be that of a movement or that of a party. And ethos is often established by showing one's membership of or affinity with some kind of particular community, some shared culture. That's why we often hear criticisms about they don't speak like us. Politicians will try to adapt the vernacular forms that they think will demonstrate their connections to people. One of the things I've been interested in is the way politicians use quotations and citations to show their familiarity with and their drawing on some element of a shared culture. They develop an image of themselves, but also develop their arguments and justifications for their policies. They use stories, they use representative anecdotes, they might use exemplum. In her new book, which I'm sure you will all want to go out and buy after this talk, Henrietta talks about how Cicero uses exemplum in different kinds of ways in his speeches. how he draws on particular figures as models for conduct, how he draws on historical examples to normalise things in the present that might appear to be novel but which he wants to show are similar to or examples of something from the past. And one can look at contemporary politicians in this country and see how part of Corbyn's appeal is the way in which he connects to a sense of the past, of political decisions and political roads not taken. One can think of the ways in which the referendum campaign harked back to exemplum of the past, to Churchill and Britain standing alone, or to the kind of odd way in which Brexiteers, even the very word Brexiteers, seems to conjure up some kind of lost imperial imaginary, a great trading nation sailing the seas to sell tea and cake to the Chinese. And ethos is also, I think, not just about the individual character, not just about the party or movement, about the demonstration of belonging in some community and some culture. It can also be a way in which political arguments invite audiences to think about who they are and who they might be if they pursue one course of action or another. And if we put the enthymeme and this idea of ethos together, then we can see how we might think about political performances as doing something really very important for public, collective and political life. We can see how individual political figures can become embodiments of political movements, embodiments of particular ideas, parts of important arguments about who we as a people are and who we perhaps could become. When I was a student, this is giving away how long ago it was, people wore lots of badges displaying their politics. And one badge I remember was one that said, this is how long ago it was, if Maggie's the answer, it must have been a very stupid question. But I think political analysts like me should take that slogan seriously and say, what is the question implied by the answer that particular political figures perform when they speak to us and when they dramatise themselves and their politics on stages before us? What questions do they think they are answering? Where do those questions come from and how are they shaped? And what kinds of answers are they giving and how are those answers being performed and how, with what effects? Public figures, I want to say, perform enthymemes. They perform demonstrations of potential or actual popular reasons for doing things or not doing things. They draw on a culturally recognised repertoire of roles and references, of values and ideas, and present it to people as part of a claim about the present, so that audiences may make a judgment, which is really always a judgment of themselves, of who they are as a people. So political performances, personality and spectacle are, from my point of view, not necessarily distractions from the issues. They may be ways of showing what a person stands for in that thick sense, represents, embodies, expresses the interests, but also the cultures and communities they stand for. And they're also ways in which a culture argues about the issues which confront us. That's what was going on in the US with Obama. It's happening now, I think, between Clinton and Trump. Not all of politics is about such spectacle and performance, but all politics has to have spectacle and performance within it. So let me just quickly conclude with some more focused thoughts on how this might help us make sense or not make sense of our contemporary politics. My argument is, as you've seen, a defence of spectacle and performance, of rites and rituals in contemporary politics, which I see as not being necessarily antithetical to good, wise democracy. Because democracy is not only about deciding on specific technical policies, it is also about evaluating the competence, character of leaders. It is about people identifying themselves as peoples, thinking about who they are, where they've come from, thinking about whether they want to stay the same or change. Doing so in this somewhat circuitous but I think necessary route of having people arise on the public stage, dramatise and perform those dilemmas before us. And maybe that can work quite well. Evidence which I just read this week suggests that in fact the presidential debates in the US have more than usual shifted opinion. Usually campaigns don't actually make that much difference to people's voting intentions, but it seems to be that in this case they have, and that they have in fact helped the Clinton campaign to a possibly unprecedented degree. We don't know, of course, until the vote actually happens. But it certainly seems that people have been able to make the judgment of character based on the performance in the debates and make a decision about who they think is in fact a competent person to hold presidential office. In the case of the UK, we might look back at the campaign over Brexit and see that part of what was poor about the Remain campaign was precisely its inability, perhaps its refusal, to dramatise its case. It allowed the performative expressions of national culture and destiny to be expressed by one side only, and failed to bring forward the kinds of spectacles and demonstrations of its own beliefs that might have engaged Remain, more people to be Remain supporters. So there is a sense in which I could say, I think things are working. But I'm not complacent. I'm not at all sanguine about where we are. But I think we can see, if we take the approach that I've laid out here, some particular ways of naming and therefore perhaps dealing with the problems of our democracy today. The first and the most important then is that what we suffer from is not too much spectacle and personality and performance, but bad performance. Too many politicians who are not great public speakers, partly because they aren't themselves well skilled in it, well trained in it, but crucially because, as classical rhetoric shows us, to be a really good orator, you need to know and care about the people you're talking to. If you don't know about them, because you come from a very narrow range of backgrounds, because your experience is limited to work in a number of institutions, universities, the law, Westminster and political parties, you will not have the capacity to think through the implications of your politics for those whom you want to persuade. You will not know the vernaculars through which you might communicate and express and dramatise the values of those you are supposed to serve. But we also suffer from some more structural problems, I think. One of those is what we might call a kind of disappearance or perhaps dissolution of the stages upon which politics might be performed. And I mean that in one sense literally. There are fewer places at which major political figures are required to perform their arguments. We don't go to public meetings. They don't give that many public meetings. It's kind of interesting that part of what the Corbyn campaign has been accompanied by is a rise in attendance at actual outdoor live public political events, but it's not a deep part of contemporary British political culture, and I think that might be a problem, because I don't think you can really fully judge a political leader until you've seen them with your own eyes. But we've also lost those stages, or seen a dissolution of political stages in a figurative sense. Part of what media networks do is reconstitute political performances as media performances. They necessarily shape and adapt them to suit the demands of that particular medium, and that can change the way in which they are constituted and the ways in which they are experienced. They become television spectacles rather than political spectacles. That may mean they get subsumed in different complex ways into show business. It's no surprise, it's no accident that one of the US presidential candidates should be famous precisely for being a showbiz personality. It's no surprise that so many politicians, having failed in this country, go on to become dancing showbiz personalities. In more complex ways, I think social media displace and erode the distinct platforms of political engagement. It's a sense in which they make it difficult to distinguish between what is personal conversation, what is advertising, what is just throwing stuff out there randomly, and what is in fact political performance and engagement. Everything both seems political and unpolitical all at the same time if you're too immersed in social media. And I think there is a problem with the way in which we expect public figures to be candid in the present day. Political figures of all kinds need to be able to speak sometimes to distinct and particular groups. If all the time political figures are being recorded, secretly or not secretly, if all the time the words they say are being replayed and relocated and to different kinds of audiences, you get all sorts of disturbances in the ways in which our political life and political representation plays out. Not to say that we shouldn't expose the things political figures say when unseen, but we need to think about the balance between what is candid and what is not candid, the balance between seeing people perform unscripted and seeing them perform in private life. Thirdly, there is, of course, and there's no way of changing this, I think, nor should we want to, a complex fragmentation of political audiences. That's partly because of the decreasing number of locations and spaces where political people might be gathered. It's also to do with the divergence of interest and diversification of interest and identities in contemporary societies. It's very important to do with the inequalities that so mark a society such as the UK right now, when polities themselves are broken and constituencies are divided in very hard and distinct ways. Political performance is going to become itself fragmented and more complicated. In that sense, what we see is what Geoffrey Alexander calls the diffusion of political performances. What he means is the breaking apart of the different elements of which they are composed. The cultural context, the scripts, the performances, the production and so forth begin to pull apart. They aren't unified as opportunities for engagement and reflection. They are unstable, disintegrated performances, the worst kind of play one can imagine. And in that kind of complex, destabilised situation, it's no surprise really that the representations our politicians perform begin to become more caricatured, more thin and stark, begin perhaps to become more hysterical, become grotesques in different kinds of ways. We also see, unfortunately, I think, the performance sometimes driving the policy, the desperation to try and establish a role in a performance that can articulate one's case to an audience becomes a search for policies and gestures that will help further that, rather than ways of thinking about how one's performances might justify one's policies. I'm thinking of, I alluded to it earlier, the story I read yesterday from Andrea Leadsom in the Cabinet, proposing that the British economy will concentrate on selling tea and jam and cakes abroad. That selection seemed to me so rooted in the particular fantasised idea of Englishness and so distant from a realistic conception of economic policy that I thought this here is emerging now as just empty performance, disconnected from any attempt to push forward some claim or argument about what we might actually do in the situation in which we find ourselves. And I think you can see in a different sort of way how part of what's happening in the Labour Party is that a desire for a certain sort of performance is now entirely disconnected from thinking about how that might be translated into government and political programmes. In other words, what we find is audiences, in the worst sense, simply seeking a positive reflection of themselves through political speech rather than a dialogue or a transformative engagement. There's an old genre of political writing from the Renaissance period, familiar to most of you, I would imagine, through Machiavelli, which was the so-called mirror for princes. Handbooks produced to communicate maxims and policy ideas to princes so that they might know and think about how to be virtuous and good rulers. What we need from political spectacle is, I would suggest, mirrors for peoples, opportunities to see themselves and see what they might be. But we always face that risk that the mirror becomes one in which we simply see an enchanted image of ourselves. So there are intense problems in the way in which our politics is taking place today. But the point I'm making is that the solution to those problems of democratic life is not the closure of the show. We should not abandon democracy, get rid of the performers, and simply employ technocrats, algorithms to carry out our policies for us. What we need are better performers, new stages. And in my more optimistic moments, I believe I can see that kind of thing beginning to happen. There are new forms of political organisation and thinking developing that try to draw on new forms of social media, new forms of communication, that try to reflect the ways in which people experience the world today rather than how those in charge imagine the world to really be. I think there are ways then of reviving political performances, democratic stagings for the 21st century. Exactly how that will be brought to fruition, I'm not going to give you a full answer now. But I do know one thing, that if new generations of politicians are going to learn how to articulate and express their visions, if they're going to learn how to connect with audiences and be part of the collective process of deciding who we're going to be, they're going to do all that, they're going to have to know about classics. They're going to have to read Henrietta's book, and they're going to have to learn from everybody else here. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.